respect for legitimate democratic aspirations leads to good outcomes. Disrespecting it in one way or another, and often surprisingly, can lead to bad outcomes for everyone. Well, Chairman, I'm always reluctant to teach lessons to other people in other countries. And can I just say to the President here that if I say anything wrong, then I will not be buying lunch for lots of people. I'm Scottish after all, we don't do these sort of things. The process is quite interesting. There were many successful things about the process of trying to reclaim Scottish independence. There was no violence. I mean, Scotland is not unique in the world, but it's unusual in that the process of self-determination in the modern era in Scotland, in the democratic era, has been achieved without a single person losing their life. In fact, nobody's had so much as a nosebleed. I think the worst excess in the entire referendum campaign of 10 years ago was that somebody got an egg thrown at them, you know, which is hardly in the great excesses of politics. So that was an extraordinary success. And that was enabled, of course, because people on each side of the argument knew that there was a process by which the argument could be decided, i.e. a referendum, a square go, as we might call it in the Scottish vernacular, an even contest whereby people could to resolve a situation. Now, that's a successful thing. And of course, it's not just one side. I mean, that has to be agreed by both sides. There's no point having a one-sided agreement. That wouldn't achieve anything. And I suppose the Edinburgh Agreement I signed with David Cameron in 2012, David Cameron being the United Kingdom Prime Minister and the lead unionist, is an example of an agreement whereby two opposing sides, came to a decision to hold a referendum and agreed to abide by the outcome. So all that's successful, and there hasn't been violence since the referendum. But of course, there have been very negative consequences. Negative consequences because of the result. Negative consequences for Scotland in that, as you rightly say, Scotland, because it's not independent, despite the fact that every single area and district of Scotland voted to remain in the European Union, every single one, all 32 districts, was taken out of the European Union because of the predominance of the votes in England against. So that's clearly a major negative consequences. There are many others I could point to. The wastage of resources, not just oil and gas, but the renewable resources in terms of the lack of benefit for the Scottish people. I mean, we have been the only country in history to discover oil and gas in substantial quantities and become relatively poorer. And we seem like we're well on the road to becoming the country which produces 10 times its electricity requirements and yet has a substantial percentage of its old people who freeze in the winter. And that sort of fuel poverty among energy plenty is a dreadful situation. So there's been negative consequences for Scotland. What's less understood is the negative consequences for England. It is a reasonable supposition that if Scotland had voted for independence, then England 2 years later would not have voted to leave the European Union. I mean, for a start, David Cameron would have resigned as Prime Minister, as I resigned as First Minister when I lost the referendum. If he'd lost the Scottish referendum, he would have resigned as Prime Minister. It was his commitment to have the referendum on the European Union. But also the whole nature and psychology of that referendum would have been fundamentally different, if indeed it had taken place at all. So that has been a huge diminution of the United Kingdom's role in the world. And of course, if you look at the UK political scene now, the two major parties of state, the parties which have ruled the United Kingdom for the last 100 years, in the case of the Conservative Party for much longer than that, are both in huge disarray. I mean, the Labour Party has just won an enormous election victory and 2-3 months later is flat on its back. You know, seems unable to govern. And the Conservative Party are just going through a leadership contest where the candidate who was emerging as the most formidable candidate has probably been knocked out by the votes of the members of Parliament before they got to send him to the Conservative electorate. So both major parties of state are in disarray. The economy is in serious trouble. The social life of England has huge tensions. There's a rise of a populist right-wing party which threatens the political establishment. So the interesting thing is, although Scotland obviously lost an opportunity, the UK has been diminished. And just one further point. Although, in referendum, you must expect outside influences of some kind or another. The European Union of that time, President Barroso in particular, it was not helpful at all to Scotland. I sympathise greatly with your difficulties at the present moment. I think it's fair to say that President Juncker, his successor, would have taken a different stance because he was a Prime Minister of a small country. But Barroso was not at all helpful. In fact, was secretly combining with the United Kingdom or the UK government. Well, what happened as a result of that is the UK, as one of the major players in the European Union, ended up leaving 18 months later. So in many ways, it was a bad outcome for Europe as a whole. On the subject of what we're talking about, to reconcile differences, you need a legal framework. You need a situation where people are prepared to say that is the treaty or agreement or understanding. You certainly need leadership because usually to get that framework in place requires the leaders of various parties or countries or factions to go beyond their own particular interest and try to understand the interests of the other side. And I do think very strongly you need the cultural bridge release. And Northern Ireland, which we might come to later, would be a very positive example of how cultural understanding has helped promote a peace which seemed so elusive for so long. My general message is respect for legitimate democratic aspirations leads to good outcomes. Disrespecting it in one way or another, and often surprisingly, can lead to bad outcomes for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.